Hey guys, upon thinking about it and talking about some things and still wanting to put out some information, I guess I am going to go against my better judgment in some senses and make some more material on preterism and see if we can't investigate the apple cart a little more closely, as it were. I want to touch on two things in this video primarily and really tighten up the scope. But the first thing I want to talk about is the resurrection ideas and just a little bit of evidence. The first thing is that when you look at, I was looking at this today, the pagan practices versus the Hebrew practices, the bone boxes, preserving the body, treating it with a certain respect, not wanting it to sit out in the open. These were things that were viewed as insults, and it seems to indicate a resurrection-minded person. And we can trace this line of thinking back if we take a look at 2nd Maccabees, and it was written in about 124 BC. We will find in chapter 14, 14, starting at verse 43. Under the pressure of the moment, Raziz misjudged the thrust of the sword, and it did not kill him. So while the soldiers were swarming into the room, he rushed to the wall and jumped off like a brave hero into the crowd below. The crowd quickly moved back, and he fell in the space they left. Still alive and burning with courage, he got up, and with blood gushing from his wounds, he ran through the crowd and finally climbed a steep rock. Now completely drained of blood, he tore out his intestines with both hands and threw them at the crowd. And as he did so, he prayed for the Lord of life and breath to give them back to him. That is how he died. He prayed for God to give his intestines back to him. I think that is a clear reference to physical resurrection minded. And bear in mind, this Maccabees is canon, depending on which canon you choose. So I wouldn't necessarily go out there and say, oh, it's just uninspired, let's throw that away. I would not say that's the case. The Protestant canon is the youngest canon. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah was written down in 135 CE-ish. But just like the Gospels, which were written much later after the occurrences, it survived as an oral tradition, and that is attested to by Josephus and others. The Mishnah had been around for a while, and it was a good while before 135. I don't think any scholar doubts that tradition goes back to the early BC ages, that this oral tradition was being handed down. And that's exactly how you got your Gospels. They were handed down orally. So let's take a look at the Mishnah, which was written down in 135. But like I said, we have every reason to believe that it's much older than 135. In the rabbinic period, the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is considered one of the central doctrines of Judaism. The 10th chapter of the Mishnah Sanhedrin begins, all of Israel has a portion in the world to come, as it is said, Isaiah 60, verse 21, and thy people are righteous, at the end they shall inherit the land. And the following have no portion in the world to come, one who says there is no resurrection of the dead. George Foot Moore, in Judaism in the First Centuries of the Christian Era, 1950. Asserts, it must be further observed, except on the single article of the revivification of the dead, there was no dogma and no canon of orthodoxy in this whole field of eschatology. The dogma was one of the important points of dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And they go on to quote several books, which no one, I think, has heard of. The rabbis include belief in the resurrection in the canonical liturgy, especially in the second of the 18 benedictions of Amida. The doctrine of the resurrection seems to embody two significant areas: the idea of retribution and reward for the Jewish nation as a whole, and not merely for individuals, And two, the idea that the body and soul are a single, indivisible unit, both essential and equal in the constitution of a human being. These two ideas may have developed or achieved prominence at different stages in the development of the doctrine. As to the first point, in the Israelite worldview, the ultimate redemption was always a redemption of the whole people. The prophets predicted a future time when there will be peace, justice, and righteousness in the world. This reward would seem to come then only to those living at the time of the redemption. The doctrine of the resurrection of the dead enables righteous souls throughout history to have a share in the world to come, the Olam Haba. As Moore points out in pages 311 to 312, the Greek religion was individualistic and needed a doctrine of immortality for the soul, in which the individual was rewarded or punished. But Jewish religion posited a reconstituted nation as the arena of retribution. The second point is somewhat more sophisticated. A rabbinic parable, however, makes it crystal clear. Sanhedrin 91a and b. And Taninius said to Rabbi, "The body and soul exonerate themselves from judgment. How is this so? The body says, the soul sinned. For from the day that it is separated from me, lo, I am like the silent stone in the gravel. And the soul says, the body is the sinner. For from the day that I separated from it, lo, I fly in the air like a bird." He answered him, "I will tell you a parable. To what is this matter likened? To a king of flesh and blood who had a beautiful orchard, and there were in it a lovely ripe fruit, and he placed two guardians over it, one a cripple and the other a blind. Said the cripple to the blind man, I see beautiful ripe fruit in the orchard. Come and carry me, and we will bring it and eat together. The cripple rode on the back of the blind man, and they brought and ate them. After a while, the owner of the orchard came and said to them, Where is my lovely fruit? The cripple answered, Do I have legs to go? Answered the blind man. Do I have eyes to see? What did he do? He placed the cripple on the back of the blind man and judged them as one. So also the Holy Blessed One brings the soul and throws it into the body and judges them as one. Neither body nor soul alone can sin or be righteous, so only the two together can be judged and punished or rewarded. Again, the comparison with the Greek idea, in which the soul is a whole personality and the body is merely its house, is instructive and yet viewed as false. Now, going from that subject, like I said, I just wanted to touch on that. These are much older traditions than anything you'll find in the Church Fathers or anything, and I probably will do a video on Polycarp, because one of the objections I seem to be getting from people is that it doesn't matter what the Church Fathers say, because their true teachings could have easily been lost. And I'm not willing to spot that point at all. I think it's a little ridiculous, because you have Clement of Rome interacting with Paul, and more importantly is Polycarp, who was a student of John. So even if I said, well, the rest of them I can throw away, I'm going to take a special look at Polycarp. And I think Clement of Rome, rightfully so, but if you're going to tell me that the student of John the Apostle lost the teachings, I mean, I wouldn't expect him maybe to remember everything, but if he was told that 70 AD was the end all, I think Polycarp would have remembered such a thing. So I'll probably look into that issue a little bit further. But now I want to talk about Genesis, and I want to talk about the problem of preterism and the sacrifice on the cross, the doctrine of atonement, if you will. And I'm going to read Genesis chapter 3 first, and we'll start from there. Actually, I might not read all of Genesis chapter 3. I don't want to bore you with it. I'll go down to start at 14, and obviously read it for yourself. I am going to touch on Genesis chapter 2, because this is where the preterist has to hang his hat. But in verse 14 it says, the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desires shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of all your days, all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and dust you shall return. The man and his wife named his wife Eve, because she was the mother of living, and the Lord God made Adam and his wife garments of skin and clothed them. Okay, I can skip all that. So we see the punishments, and as a side note to this, you might want to look at Sir William's videos on original sin. If I remember, I'll link them in there, because this issue is all kind of wrapped up in this. These are the punishments, okay? Now, the big beef with the preterism thing, the preterist has to hang his hat on Genesis 2:17, okay? And they say, in that day you shall surely die. And they have to take that literally. Now, I don't know of anywhere in the Bible where it teaches that Adam died spiritually that day he ate from the tree. I don't, it's just not there as far as I can tell. It's, Paul says, through sin, death entered the world. And the world he's talking about, obviously, is the cosmos that we inhabit, the earth. And this, I think, is further implied by the simple fact, when you read his punishment, he tells him, you were taken from the dust of the ground, and to dust you shall return. It doesn't say he was taken from anywhere else, and I don't think a spirit would be taken from the dust of the ground. And if we go back to what we learned in the Mishnah, the life, okay, the spirit is just another word for that when it comes to human beings. The breath in you and your body constitute a person, not a soul, okay? And then you look furthermore at what he says in verse 22 in chapter 3. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the garden to work on the ground from which it was taken. He drove out man, and to the east of the garden he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned away to guard the way to the tree of life. The reason Adam died is because he was cut off from the tree. This has nothing to do with a spiritual death. Was he separated from God? Yeah, you can make the implication of that. But Adam was the same person. The only thing that changed was his relationship, his closeness to God. Not that a spiritual condition. And his physical death was brought on by the lack of the ability to take from the tree of life. If he would have let him stay there, I think Adam was already eaten from the tree of life, because Genesis says what? It says he could eat from any tree, just not this one. And we also see that this tree is supposed to be restored to the earth for the healing of nations in the book of Revelation. But when you look at it, it makes very perfect logical sense to me that the reason he died is because he was cut off from the tree. Okay, man is not a spirit. I don't see that in the Old Testament as far as like a soul. It's not what is seen. And as we've seen from 2nd Maccabees and from the Mishnah teachings, which are much older than the New Testament, and are the beliefs that the Pharisaical Jews have carried down, this is important to remember. These people are still here. This tradition came from before Jesus and to after, and you notice Jesus and the Pharisees did not have an argument about the resurrection. Jesus and the Sadducees had an argument about the resurrection, as well did Paul. And when Paul argued with them, the Pharisees backed up Paul that there was a resurrection, okay, of living spirits. There's so many phrases that are used, but the bottom line is there's nothing else to us, okay? And this is going to become important in that sense because the Bible does not teach hell. This is important to remember. The punishment, the wages of sin is death, okay? So the premise I'm going to start operating under is simply this. It's the reason Jesus had to die on the cross. If our end result, and this is one of those common sense logic things, if the end result was to eternally burn in hell, or to have our soul, if you will, destroyed, then Jesus would have to go through that according to the scriptures. He paid your price. Your price. Through sin, death entered the world, and the power of sin is the law. That's what Paul says. And there's no need for Jesus to die in the atonement, because the preterist believes that physical death, at least the ones I've interacted with, it seems to be their overall doctrine, is that physical death was in the Garden of Eden. So Jesus physically dying was not a punishment that he would not have suffered anyway. All mankind suffers that punishment of physical death. And to the preterist, it wasn't a punishment. It's what was happening in the Garden of Eden to begin with. So man was already dying, and God must have viewed that death as good. Now, when you read the Psalms and you read Proverbs, it talks about death as being something that wasn't meant to be, that it separates the believer from God, that it silences him from among his people and his brethren. Death was not intended. And I don't believe there was death in the Garden of Eden. And we see clearly in verses 22 to 24, the only reason Adam dies is because he's blocked from this tree. Whatever this tree is, however we want to interpret that. But we know it's not literally Jesus. We know it's not literally God, because it's different language. It's a tree. It's something else. And you see it in the book of Revelations being for the healing of the nations. Well, nations, I don't think exist in heaven personally, but that's my 2 cents. So if the punishment for sin is death, that's the punishment. That's what you will have. Because of sin, death enters. So the preterist has to go to Genesis 2:17, and when eating of that day, you shall surely die, as how it's translated. Now, they take that literally. They have to. They say that when Adam ate of that very moment, he spiritually died. You don't see this anywhere in the Bible. It does not talk about Adam spiritually dying. It talks about him dying. And death is a term of finality, and even the term you find in the book of Revelations, the lake of fire. The lake of fire is an Egyptian term. That's where the lake of fire comes from. It wasn't a Jewish concept. He was borrowing from the language. The book is apocalyptic. It's about translating imagery. And I'm not saying I understand all the imagery in the book of Revelation. Some of it is quite confusing, but it's not a Jewish thing, okay? And it says death in Hades, or death in the grave, Sheol, from their concept. The act of dying and the grave that holds the dead will be destroyed in this lake of fire, which I don't necessarily see that as literal. And being that's apocalyptic literature, it's probably not literal. It's an imagery of the end of death. And we all know what death means. The second death is to be tossed into this lake of fire. So it wouldn't make sense to me to have you die spiritually, then die physically, and then be judged and die again. This doesn't make any sense. We are one unit. But I just want to touch on some things where I disagree with that. Because what they're going to say, like I said, is that day has to be very literal. Okay? It has to be that day that something happened. I don't take it that way. I never did. I always took it in the sense of a poetic sense. Like you tell a story in the days of Noah, in the day of Noah, I should say, in the day of the Lord, in the day of retribution. These are signposts in ages. You know, the day of the Lord may not be the best example because that's a more literal day that would happen. But it's even it is a marker of an age. You know, this eternal life. You know, the book of John, you can cut that into two sections. One is the indwelling of this spirit, and two is the aeon. And the Hebrew, they didn't have a word for eternity. They didn't. They talked about ages. So there's a lot of little goofy stuff, but let me stay on topic. There were two verses that even a preterist, and this is just the only two that I decided to fool with, has to do something with if they're going to force literal translations on people. Like I said, I'm not aware of anywhere in the New Testament where it says Adam spiritually died that day. That's, you know, it's not. Sin, death entered the world through sin. But there's two other verses in the Bible where we can do this now. Now, when you read, if you're a John fan and you read John 8:56, Abraham lived to see my day. Do you just arbitrarily change that to mean a period? I mean, the definition of it is a day. It's a period from sunrise to sunset. So, do you just arbitrarily decide that that's not a literal day? Because you know, if Abraham actually saw Jesus, if he saw the day of Jesus, and we know how that discussion was going, he told him that he wasn't even 50 years old. So we know there was some polemical game going on right there. But you don't take that as a literal day, do you? Okay. One that's even more exact. Luke 23:43. Today you will be with me in paradise. Now, if Jesus died and he was actually dead, which is what the word means, the only place that you have is this thing in 2 Peter, which the scholars I've read already, they need a critical amendation for it because it's a ripoff of the book of Enoch. But do you believe that literal day, why Jesus was dead in the ground, that thief was with him in paradise? And the only, you know, I know how I translate these verses, but that's not what I'm asking. Literal days. But now let's go back to Genesis 2 and read some interesting information here. There are some significant differences in the Hebrew words that have been translated as die and surely die in recording of the communications of the Lord, Adam, Eve, and the serpent. The quote from the scriptures that follow are word-by-word translations from the Interlinear Bible by J.P. Green. And following each passage, there is a magnified selection from the Interlinear Bible, which is included, shown in detail, the recorded Hebrew translations as die in each passage. Remember, Hebrew is read from right to left. Of every tree of the garden surely you may eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it. In the day of your eating from it you shall surely you shall die. Notice that the Hebrew word Strong's number 4191 is repeated, which is a technique often used in the Hebrew for emphasis, and the last of the passage is often translated more literally as dying, thou shalt die. A less literal translation is, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall be doomed to die. For we know from reading the rest of the story, the penalty was not sudden physical death, but as soon as the disobedience occurred, Adam and Eve's relationship with the Lord was drastically changed, and they were reduced to hiding in the bushes. The penalties were soon announced, and they were banished from the garden to continue the rest of their life in the toil and sorrows. And said the woman to the serpent, of the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden had said God, not shall you eat of it, nor shall you touch it. Genesis 3:2-3. Notice that Eve did not repeat the forms of the words of the Lord. Instead, she varied the Hebrew word translated as die and did not use the repeated word from form used for emphasis. She also added the phrase about not touching it. The word form she used is unusual, and similar forms appear only in Numbers 16:29 and Isaiah 22:14. And in both of these occurrences, it appears to mean a physical death under conditions of judgment. It would appear that in her statement she was possibly showing her uncertainty or lack of full understanding as to exactly when and what would be the result of her disobedience and the seriousness of the penalty. Eve would seem to have no way of knowing about death unless she witnessed the physical death of some plant or animal. The reply of the serpent is phrased negatively and returns the repeated word form, but uses the same word form as the Lord for the first word and the word of Eve for the second word. This repeated word form is unique and appears nowhere else in the scriptures. Therefore, the reply seems to be directed to how Eve had phrased her answer and to be correcting her statement or adding special emphasis in a negative way. There surely must be meanings within the Hebrew word changes that are not fully revealed by translations. Looking in the Strong's dictionary for the words in the Hebrew Bible, we found the following: 4191, muth, a prime root, to die, literatively or figuratively. Casualty, to kill at all, crying, dead body, man, put to death, worthy, destroy, cause to be like to, must die, kill, necro, must needs slay, and surely and very suddenly, and also in the why. So he's going to, you can't see it, but the highlighted text is surely or very suddenly. Note, there is also the possible meaning, especially for the repeated verb form, of a very sudden death. None of the translators have included the possibility that there is a sudden time implication in the words. Looking in The Word by Isaac E. Mosen, we find the following: Kat. It too is a cutting term. There is a range of time words in Hebrew, and it goes through the yam, the tam, the mat, is to be finished, to be destroyed, to cease, or to be spent, such as in Numbers 26:20. Reversing this term brings to die and when, is formerly or yesterday. Genesis 31:2, on contrary, means always or continuity, Exodus 28:29. Indicating that the words translated as die are in a family of words whose variations can also indicate a timelessness. The short two-letter form is found a number of times in the later part of Genesis, as shown in the selection below from Genesis 50, verse 5, and that would be translated as I am dying. It would appear that Eve is either being corrected or gaining new information concerning the result of her disobedience. Possibly the recorded serpent's reply could be more literally, word for word translated as, not dying shall you die suddenly. This would be contrary to what many have concluded, in that they have proposed that the serpent was contradicting the Lord. Instead, it is proposed that the serpent, as wise or as subtle, was communicating in truth that is partial truths. The apparent confusion on Eve's part causes us to wonder if she fully understood all of the terrible consequences of disobedience. It would appear that Eve, by using the short form to die, with the added vowel connected to the consonant, was saying that she believed that if she touched the fruit of the tree of knowledge at that moment she would die, while the Lord was using a softer form of to die, which did not necessarily indicate sudden death. The serpent was then possibly informing her that the tree of knowledge was not about death, but as its name implied, was about knowledge only. No information is given to explain how severely the act of disobedience would be punished. Eve then saw that the fruit was pleasant to the eye, and somehow even saw that it was good to eat. How she saw it was good to eat is not explained. Could it possibly be that she witnessed the fruit being eaten, possibly being eaten by the serpent? And then she took the fruit thereof and did eat of it, and gave it also to her husband, and he did eat? The alternate translation of the communication between the serpent and Eve is proposed, which is believed to be more in line with the Masoretic text, as suggested by the Strong's Dictionary. The new translation changes the serpent's answer to Eve from a direct contradiction to the words of the Lord to that of informing Eve the result of her disobedience would not be a sudden physical death. A less literal translation could be, "You will not very suddenly die." So, that, to me, you don't even need all that information to draw that inference, but it's nice to have the syntactical information that it is very possible to look at the verse in a different light. But we do see that the death was the product of being thrown out of the garden. It wasn't the product of taking the fruit from the tree. Physical death is what entered the world. And it makes a lot of sense that if Eve had never seen anything die, they were vegetarians. What would she really know about death? It's very interesting to pontificate on. But at the end of the day, the simple point is this. The doctrine of the atonement revolves around Christ paying the price that you were supposed to pay. And the price you were supposed to pay was that physical death through sin. There literally is no reason for Christ to die and be resurrected physically in his body, because our price would have been something else. If you believe in hell, it would be eternal punishment in hell. If you believe that death was final, in other words, there's no resurrection and the wicked are destroyed, then those are the two things Jesus should be doing right now, in all logical honesty, if he paid your price. If it's not those two things, if it is those two things, and all he did was die the physical death that preterists said we were going to die anyway, then it literally just makes no sense. He paid a price of what? The natural death of man, which God must have decreed as good because it existed in the Garden of Eden. Even to be perfect, Jesus would have had to die because death was a perfectly good and natural thing. So if my eternal punishment was to spiritually die, as in a soul, if my soul, a separate thing from me, was to be eternally dead, then that's the price Jesus should have paid. He should have paid eternal death and been remembered as a hero that delivered us all from sin. But the wages of sin is death, and death means to cease to exist. That's what death means. We have no real evidence. We have no evidence of death in the garden before this. There is no reason to take the text ultra literal and say, oh, they had to die right there, right then and there. One, we have the poetic knowledge of this text. And if you're old earth creation, if you don't think the earth was created in 7 literal days, then this should be no problem for you, because you already are doing that to the term yom. If you're a young earth creationist, then yeah, you'll take it literal. You'll take the 7-day story of creation as 7 literal days. But I'm saying it's not necessary in either case. And we've already seen from 2nd Maccabees, which is coming from 124-ish BC. And we see from the Mishnah, which is the Pharisaical documents and oral tradition that was handed down. It was written about 135, but it goes all the way back to the Second Temple. And as a matter of fact, one of the neat properties of the Mishnah is that it speaks as if the temple is still standing. So it's pretty well intact, and it may have some errors in it. That's fine. I'm not trying to defend inerrancy with the Mishnah, but the Mishnah does prove that the Pharisaical belief was a physical resurrection. It proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And appealing to its date of 135 as a written date it's no scholar would support you. It's retarded. It was an oral tradition that was established long before Jesus was ever born. It's the oral law written down. That's what it is. So it's clear to me that the physical resurrection was there in the Mishnah, which is the Pharisaical teaching. They're the ones who appealed to the oral law. Jesus sided with the Pharisees on the topic of resurrection. So did Paul. And they all fought against the Sadducees, who some of which were Nicolaitans. They had different beliefs. Some of them believe in the resurrection only of a soul. That's another misconception people have, is that they believe the the Sadducees only believed one thing, and that is just not true. A lot of them hated the flesh, and they were called a more liberally leaning sect at the time. So there's a lot of strong evidence there, and it makes the atonement a very curious thing. If Jesus paid the price on the cross, that was the price. See, that's when the transaction was done. That was the ratification. Jesus didn't descend into some eternal burning hell. His soul, quote unquote, was not destroyed. It was the death was the transaction. The physical death is what Adam suffered. He came from dust and he would return to dust. There is only two components you can attribute in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 to man. It is the breath of God, the pneuma, the life, the nefesh. And animals have the same nefesh that we do. So unless you want to say an animal has a soul, it's a very well understood doctrine in Judaism. It's your life. It's the ability to be alive. Combined with the dust of the earth are the two components that make up man. So if you're going to say his soul died, there is no evidence for that of having a soul in Genesis. And if you're going to use the more sense spiritually, as in some sense outside of himself, spiritually died, I've always never understood why people say this kind of thing, because it doesn't really convey anything. They were separated from God. That's it. And it led to their physical death because they were blocked out of the Garden of Eden. Whatever this fruit was, it's clear in the story that if Adam would have had access to it, he could have stayed alive indefinitely. So by cutting him out, he died. It was a physical death. From dust you are, and dust you shall return. There's nothing that teaches that Adam spiritually died in the entire Bible, to my understanding. And I'm sure if someone has actual verses saying this, they will correct me on it. But I've never come across it. I've never come across where Paul taught that Adam spiritually died in the garden. He talks about death entering the world. And we see what that death is. It was a physical death. We pair that to the atonement on the cross, the transaction that bought the new covenant into existence and bought the forgiveness of your sins, was blood shed from a man on a cross. He paid your price. Think about that. He paid your price on the cross. What was your price? Your price is the wages of sin is death. Death means to cease to exist. Necro. It means you're done. You're finished. There's nothing else. You're done. So if there was some other kind of punishment, that's the punishment Jesus should have paid. There is no need for Jesus to die on the cross if the death that we suffered was a spiritual death. What need is there for that? It's a good and natural thing. I cannot stress this enough. In Preterism, they believe death was a natural thing that took place in the garden with Adam and Eve. And Jesus would have been decreed to die then anyway. He was going to die anyway. The whole point of the atonement is that Jesus suffered for something he did not do and he did not deserve. And that was that he was the unblemished lamb who was not guilty of sinning. and he suffered the punishment of sin. The wages of those sins were death, not anything else. It was dying. It was the literal act of ceasing to exist that we find in the Psalms that separated him from his people and from his God. And when he died, you have to ask yourself, as a preterist or anybody else, what was he doing for 3 days? Did he take that man to paradise before the judgment happened? Before 70 AD? Was that man with him in paradise? Did Abraham live to see his day? We have no problem taking those as metaphorical, and I think they should be. That's my take on it. Except with the possibility of John, I have reason to believe that that may not be the case. But at the end of the day, we take those metaphorically. But when we come to Genesis, we force that literal translation that as soon as they did that, they spiritually died. The Bible doesn't say that anywhere. It doesn't say they died spiritually anywhere. It says the act that they did enabled something to enter the world, and it's what killed mankind. It's death. And we see in chapter 2 and chapter 3 the reason he died. Think about it. If he would have ate of the fruit, right? And God would have never thrown them out of the garden, they'd still be alive today. That's the fact of the matter. And if that is true, if they still would have been alive today and never die, because they would have had access to the tree of life, whatever that is exactly, there's just no point. It wouldn't matter. Who cares if you're spiritually dead? He's alive forever. What's the difference? No, the separation of God was the byproduct of casting them out of the garden. If the atonement is the transaction of the cross, if that is the transaction that bought you as a people for God, he paid your price in your place. He took what you deserve, physical death. He did not go and burn in hell forever, because an eternal punishment would demand an eternal payment. And I hate to sound like second grade logic here, but it's simple. If you believe that you're a preterist and you believe that people go to burn in hell literally forever, that's where Jesus should be right now. You can't pay an eternal price with a finite amount of money, can you? If you believe that that is to be destroyed permanently forever, then that's what should have happened to Jesus. He should have been destroyed permanently forever. But the punishment for our transgressions is the fact that we die. It's the fact that we're separated from our families and our loved ones. It's the fact that we have to watch our loved ones die. It's the fact that one day we will fall silent and have no knowledge of anything at all, is what the Bible says. That was our punishment. And he took the punishment he did not deserve, and he paid it. He died. It doesn't even matter how he died. I mean, in all honesty, it doesn't matter how Jesus died. The only thing that matters is that he actually died and did not deserve it. That is the punishment. That is the price that he biblically paid. To say anything outside of that is completely outside of the Bible. The whole atonement transaction took place on the cross, and it's not attributed to anything else. It said he learned obedience, he built up to it, it's the crescendo of the story, and he didn't want to do it, not because he was disobedient, but because he was terrified. He was a peaceful man, and he did it. And I would say that preterism, in my opinion, does come dangerously close to denying the atonement, if it doesn't deny the atonement. Because now you have to figure out a way to say a man dying that was completely natural and ordained by God, that everyone should die. So there's nothing special about a man dying who didn't sin, because you believe people were dying in the Garden of Eden, or things were dying in the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve fell. The physical death of Jesus literally makes no sense, number one. To assign the atonement to anything outside of the cross does not make any biblical sense. Number three, if you believe that the punishment for the sinner in the book of Revelation is to burn in the lake of fire, then Jesus should be burning in the lake of fire. Or if you believe that the sinner is destroyed, never to rise again, then Jesus should have been destroyed, never to rise again. That's what it means to pay the price for someone. If you're going to go to court and defend someone in your family and they committed a heinous crime and they say, here's the death, we're going to give that person a death penalty. And you say, I will take his punishment. And then you give him $100 and they let you go. You didn't take his punishment. That was not an equal transaction. And I would say that's something very, very dangerous that you need to stop and consider if you're considering preterism. It doesn't add up, does it? This spiritual death that the Bible doesn't teach anywhere about Adam and Eve. It's clear the wages of sin is death. Not spiritual death, it's death. It's physical death. Those who fall silent, those who fall asleep, and their good works will follow them. They're dead. Jesus was dead. We looked at 2 Maccabees, written in 124. We reviewed the Mishnah. We see resurrection as a pharisaical practice. You know, there's so much more I could say. I'm going to stop. I don't want to drone on. I just want to make sure I drill that subject. I want to make sure that we take a good look at that and understand what it means to say that. What it means to say that Jesus died a physical death. The scales, they don't work out. They don't work out at all. They really don't. The scales make no sense in that transactional phase. And I would have to say it. You really do deny the atonement. Jesus dying was natural. It was preordained. It was supposed to happen, not as a prophecy, but simply as a matter of fact, because God decreed it was good and that everything should die from the beginning. I don't believe that, obviously. I think that that Jesus has paid my price to establish the new covenant, and forgiveness of sins is contained within that. So that's all I'm going to say right now. Think about that. Think about that. Does it weigh out? Does it make sense to you that he paid a price that really didn't even pay the fine? Jewish people believe that the creation is good. God didn't want death to come into the world, but it's a byproduct of the decisions that were made. God bless.